The gentle wind danced through Maplewood, Ohio, bringing along the lovely aroma of burning leaves and the first soft hints of autumn. Welcome to my channel. If you like the story, please subscribe. Outside the cozy little house, the trees were starting to show their first signs of transformation, while inside, the air felt thick and heavy like a warm blanket. It was as if the very walls were aware of the changes that were on the horizon. Charlotte stood happily by the stove, stirring a pot of soup that was barely giving off any scent at all. They didn't have much left to eat, but Charlotte did her best to stretch what they had as far as possible. At just 13, she had learned too quickly how to make do with little, how to look after Sophie and Jack, and how to keep the home running smoothly, even while the world outside seemed to be falling apart. Charlotte glanced over at her mother Mary, resting on the well-loved couch, her once strong form now delicate and fragile. Mary's breaths came slowly and deliberately, each one seeming to be carefully taken to make them last. The soft sunlight filtering through the window made her skin look even paler, almost like it was glowing. Her eyes fluttered open and met Charlotte's for a brief moment. They didn't need to exchange words. They both understood everything that was unspoken. "Charlotte, honey, come here for a second," Mary called out softly, her voice barely above a whisper but just strong enough for Charlotte to catch from across the room. Charlotte wiped her hands on her apron and made her way over with a smile. Each step felt a little heavier than the last, but she was determined. She knelt beside the couch, her heart beating loudly in her chest. Mary reached out a shaky hand, and Charlotte took it gently, feeling how cool it was despite the cozy warmth of the room. Mary's fingers barely curled around hers. "Is it time for your medicine?" Charlotte asked, trying to keep her voice steady as though they were chatting about something normal. She already had a good idea of the answer, but she felt the need to fill the silence with something. Mary shook her head slightly, her breath light and airy. "Not yet, soon." Her eyes drifted off for a moment before finding their way back to Charlotte's face. "You're doing so wonderfully, taking care of them." "I know it's hard," Charlotte said, swallowing as her throat felt tight. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want the weight of holding this family together. Not at 13, not like this, but she couldn't voice any of those feelings. Instead, she nodded, feeling her mother's words settle deeper into her heart. "They're such good kids," Charlotte said softly. "Sophie, she's been helping with Jack. Him busy." Mary smiled weakly, a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sophie's a sweetheart. You both are." The words hung in the air for a moment before the room was filled with nothing but the sound of Mary's breathing. Shallow and uneven. Charlotte bit the inside of her cheek, fighting back tears. She couldn't let herself break down. Not now, not in front of her mother. "I don't know how long I've got, Charlotte." Mary finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, almost like a gentle sigh. "But you're so strong. I really need you to be strong for them. Do you think you can do that?" Charlotte's heart ached. She wanted to yell that she wasn't strong, that she was just a kid who felt so lost. But Mary's eyes were searching hers, filled with a hope that Charlotte didn't feel quite ready to provide. "I will," Charlotte softly whispered, her words catching in her throat. "I promise I'll take care of them." Mary's eyes softened, a flicker of relief lighting up her face. She squeezed Charlotte's hand, or at least she tried to. "Thank you, sweetheart." For a moment, Charlotte just knelt there, holding her mother's hand while the light outside faded and the shadows in the room grew longer. Sophie's soft giggles from the other room barely pierced the heavy silence, a sweet reminder that life went on outside this space, even as it felt like it was slipping away inside. The morning light gently crept into the small bedroom, casting a soft glow over the walls. Charlotte sat at the foot of the bed, her hands clenched at her sides, gazing at her mother's still figure. The air in the room felt heavy, unmoving. "Mama," she called softly, even though she already knew. Her mother's body lay still, her chest no longer rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of breath. The lines on her face, once etched with weariness, were now frozen in a serene, empty stillness. Charlotte moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch her mother's arm. It was cold. So cold she pulled her hand back as if she'd touched something scalding. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls tightening around her, and her chest constricted until she could hardly breathe. Then the tears came, sudden and unstoppable, and she dropped to her knees beside the bed, her body shaking with quiet sobs. Mary was gone. Charlotte's mind swirled in confusion. How could she possibly do this without her? How could she keep Sophie and Jack safe now? But the weight of sorrow pushed those thoughts away, and all she could do was cry, her face buried in the sheets that still held the faintest hint of her mother's scent. She didn't know how long she remained there, but eventually, the sound of small footsteps padding across the floor reached her. Sophie appeared in the doorway, clutching her beloved stuffed bear to her chest. "Is Mommy still sleeping?" Sophie asked, her voice soft and curious. Charlotte quickly wiped her eyes, standing up and straightening herself. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice thick. "Mummy, still sleeping." Sophie looked confused for a moment, but didn't ask more. She simply nodded and shuffled back. The hallway. Charlotte stood frozen, watching her sister disappear, wondering how she would ever explain what had happened. The news of Mary's passing spread quickly through the small community of Maplewood. And Maggie, the neighbor who had always helped out whenever she could, was the first to arrive at the house. She didn't say much when she saw Charlotte's swollen eyes or the hollow look on her face. Instead, she just wrapped her arms around Charlotte in a tight embrace. "We'll get through this, my dear," Maggie softly said. "We'll get through it together." The funeral was calm and modest. Maggie lovingly took charge of most of the arrangements, reaching out to the local funeral home and gathering some neighbors to help with food. Charlotte stood by her mother's resting place, her fingers gently holding Sophie's hand while Jack played joyfully in the grass, completely unaware of the somber atmosphere around them. Sophie was quiet, perhaps a bit too quiet for a 7-year-old. She looked around with wide eyes filled with curiosity, not quite grasping why everyone seemed so down. Charlotte sensed her sister's confusion, but struggled to find the right words to explain it. "Why is Mommy in the ground?" Sophie asked, suddenly tugging at Charlotte's arm. Her voice was soft, delicate. Charlotte knelt down, looking into Sophie's eyes. She wished she could say something warm and reassuring, something that would resonate with a child. But all she managed was, "Mommy's gone, sweet pea." Sophie's brow furrowed. "Is she coming back?" Charlotte bit her lip, fighting back the wave of feelings that threatened to overflow. She shook her head gently. "No, she's not, sweetheart." For a long moment, Sophie just gazed at her, then turned away from the grave. "But I want her to come back." "I know, my love," Charlotte whispered, pulling Sophie close to her heart. "I do too." Days went by, yet the house felt different, no longer a home. Every corner seemed to call out Mary's name, the air thick with her absence. Charlotte went through the motions of cooking, cleaning, and making sure Sophie and Jack were both fed and cared for. But each chore felt empty, as if she were simply following the routines of someone else's life. Jack, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware of the shift. He laughed, played, and bounced around in the delightful way only a 2-year-old can. Sophie watched him sometimes with a hint of envy, wishing she could also be oblivious to the heaviness of it all. The burden felt too heavy for Charlotte to bear on her own. Auntie visited frequently, often bringing food and lending a hand where she could. But Charlotte could see the concern in her eyes. She wasn't just worried about Mary, she was concerned about what lay ahead. It arrived sooner than Charlotte anticipated. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. Charlotte opened it to find 2 unfamiliar faces standing on the porch, authorities. They wore serious expressions, their hands clasped in front of them. "We're here about the children," one of them said, their voice professional yet distant. "Given the situation, they can't remain here alone." Charlotte's heart sank. She didn't need them to elaborate. She already sensed what was about to happen. "They'll be placed in a foster care center in Dayton," the other one announced. Charlotte stood frozen, the world around her crumbling once more. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of, fading into the gray horizon. Inside the car, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the soft hum of the engine. Charlotte sat rigidly in the back seat. Sophie on one side and Jack on the other. Sophie clutched her stuffed rabbit, her wide eyes staring out the window, while Jack, oblivious to the tension, fidgeted, restless in Charlotte's lap. "Sha, where are we going?" Sophie finally asked, her voice small and uncertain. Charlotte took a deep breath, feeling her throat a bit parched. She didn't have an explanation that would truly make sense. What could she possibly say that everything was about to shift, that the only home they had ever cherished was gone for good? She stole a glance at Sophie and then looked out the window, her heart feeling heavy with a mix of worry and acceptance. "I'm not quite sure, Soph," Charlotte softly whispered, gently running her fingers through Jack's lovely curls, "but I'm right here, and we'll sort this out together." The car bounced along the bumpy road, and with each mile they traveled, the world they once knew faded further away. The sky outside darkened, with clouds thickening as if reflecting the uncertainty that lay ahead. When they pulled up, the orphanage stood before them, an old brick building, its walls showing the wear of time and neglect. The windows were dim, and a faint odor of dampness lingered in the air. Charlotte stepped out of the car, holding Jack close. As Sophie followed closely behind, they were guided inside through long, chilly corridors lined with faded tiles. The place had a sterile feel, as if no real joy had ever flourished there. Inside, the smell of disinfectant was quite strong. The sound of distant footsteps echoed off the walls, and Charlotte felt a little shiver run down her spine. The orphanage was nothing like their cozy home. It felt impersonal and detached, a place for lost souls, not for families. A woman in a neatly pressed suit greeted them with a stiff smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome, children," she said in a brisk tone. "We'll take wonderful care of you here." Charlotte nodded quickly. The woman's words didn't provide any comfort. They felt like the closing of a chapter, something significant that she couldn't quite put her finger on. She could sense Sophie's fingers slipping into her hand, a gentle plea for reassurance. "Everything's going to be okay," Charlotte murmured, giving Sophie's hand a soft squeeze, but even as she spoke, she wasn't entirely convinced. The days at the orphanage began to blend together. Each morning felt the same, with a long line of children waiting in the hallway for breakfast, the clattering of trays in the dining hall, the same rigid beds, and two bright lights that never dimmed enough at night. Charlotte tried to keep herself busy, aimed to care for Sophie and Jack the way she always had, but it felt tougher. There were so many rules here, and too many eyes watching them. Sophie, with her gentle sweetness and those big innocent eyes, quickly caught the attention of one of the visiting couples. It started subtly with the way they smiled at her, the way they lingered a little too long when they came to visit. At first, Charlotte tried to brush it off, but soon it became hard to ignore. One evening, as the children played quietly in the common room, Charlotte noticed the couple watching them. Sophie again. The woman, dressed in a smart coat and expensive shoes, knelt to talk to Sophie, her voice soft and kind. Sophie smiled shyly, clutching her stuffed rabbit a little tighter. Charlotte's heart sank. She slowly realized Sophie would be taken away, just like their mother. Another loss for their family. As days went by, the couple visited more often. Charlotte felt helpless as they bonded with Sophie. They brought Sophie toys and treats, which she accepted with wonder. Sophie didn't fully understand, but Charlotte did. The couple arrived with papers, taking Sophie by the hand to leave. Charlotte froze, watching as Sophie's figure vanished from sight. Jack was too young to understand, but Charlotte felt a heavy loss. She was left alone with memories as the orphanage door clicked shut. Days became a monotonous blur of gray walls and routines. Charlotte adapted to the orphanage's coldness, but Jack remained a piece of her old life. He clung to her, trusting and seeking comfort in her presence. Every night she tucked him in and shared stories, her voice soothing in the dim light. Jack would ask about their mother, and Charlotte would gently recount how much she loved them. Jack would fall asleep, but Charlotte lay awake, wondering how long until they came for him too. It all started like it had with Sophie. Quiet visits from prospective parents made her heart race, as she noticed their lingering gazes on Jack. She tried to hold on to hope, but it never turned out differently. One morning, Charlotte was called to the head office. The woman spoke calmly, delivering news that felt painful to Charlotte. Jack was chosen for adoption. A couple was excited to take him in. They would arrive at the end of the week. Charlotte felt frozen, struggling to understand. Jack, her little boy who depended on her, was leaving. She wanted to fight back, but felt powerless. What could a 15-year-old girl really say? The following days were a blur. Jack was too young to grasp what was happening, and Charlotte kept it from him. She cherished every moment with him, holding him close and playing longer, trying to freeze time. At night, she lay beside him, knowing it was almost over. Then the day arrived. Charlotte held Jack's hand at the window, watching the car approach. Her heart raced, feeling uneasy. Jack, unaware, smiled and asked if they were going on a trip. Charlotte struggled with her words, whispering to him gently. She told him he'd be with nice people for a while, but she'd always be there in spirit. Jack, confused, expressed his wish to stay with her. Charlotte felt her heart ache as she acknowledged his feelings. The couple arrived with smiles, but Charlotte barely noticed. She stood still as they greeted Jack, encouraging him to leave. He paused, glancing back at her, and for a moment she hoped he would run to her. She wished he would. She wanted to hold him and never let go, but he didn't. He turned his small fingers, slipping from hers as the couple led him outside. Charlotte watched from the doorway, her heart breaking with every step. He took the car doors shut with a hollow thud, and then the car pulled away, taking Jack with it. She stood there long after they were gone, the emptiness in the house deepening, the silence growing heavier. Now there was no one. The days in the orphanage passed like shadows, each one blending into the next with no real beginning or end. Charlotte had stopped keeping track of time. She had no family left, no Sophie, no Jack. The silence that followed. Departures created a profound silence. Charlotte had dedicated herself to caring for others, and with their absence, she felt a void. She roamed the foster home aimlessly. While other children interacted, Charlotte remained isolated. She lacked the motivation to participate. Her once lively spirit had diminished. She mechanically navigated her days, barely perceiving her surroundings until she encountered the kitchen. The aroma of baking bread one afternoon rekindled her longing for culinary connection. Cooking evoked memories of her mother and provided a sense of reality. Compelled by the scent, she entered the kitchen and observed the staff preparing dinner. Unconsciously, she took a cutting board and began to chop vegetables, her hands instinctively recalling forgotten skills. The staff permitted her actions, silently observing her renewed focus as she transitioned between tasks. Consequently, Charlotte increasingly occupied the kitchen space. The orphanage's cold atmosphere felt less oppressive within its confines. Amidst the sounds of cooking, she regained her sense of stability, with culinary activities serving as her emotional refuge. She began to innovate, incorporating subtle enhancements to the communal meals. These modifications, albeit minor, attracted staff attention, leading to increased responsibilities and autonomy in the kitchen after school. Although minimal, this newfound purpose was significant for Charlotte, absent since her family's separation. Then, a pivotal moment arose when Mrs. Taylor, a staff member, presented Charlotte with a flyer. The flyer announced a local cooking competition scheduled for the following month. Mrs. Taylor's calm yet supportive tone suggested Charlotte might find interest in it. Charlotte examined the flyer, her fingers grazing the glossy surface. The competition, intended for amateurs, offered a platform to display culinary talents, with the winner receiving a scholarship for a prestigious culinary school in New York. Charlotte's heart raced at the mention of New York. It felt like another world entirely, a place so far removed from the small, confining existence she had known. But could she do it? Did she even deserve to try? The idea of stepping outside the orphanage, of testing herself in the real world, felt overwhelming. She had spent so long retreating into herself, hiding in the kitchen, that the thought of competing, of standing in front of people again, seemed impossible. Yet something inside her stirred. For the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt a flicker of hope, small but persistent. Maybe this was her way out. Maybe this was her chance to rebuild something, to finally move forward. The weeks leading up to the competition were grueling. Charlotte spent every spare moment practicing refining her dishes, perfecting her. The kitchen became her sanctuary, the only place where she could block out the weight of everything she had lost. The staff encouraged her, giving her extra time and ingredients to experiment with. Mrs. Taylor even arranged for her to shadow a local chef, giving her a taste of what life outside the orphanage might be like. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. Charlotte nervously participated in a competitive kitchen environment with other contestants. Despite the chaos, she felt an internal transformation indicating her true calling. Her dish, inspired by her mother's recipe, received commendation from the judges, leading to an unexpected victory. Winning the scholarship to New York represented a significant opportunity for Charlotte after a prolonged struggle. Although the future appeared uncertain, she envisioned a pathway to regain control over her life. New York's dynamic atmosphere could be overwhelming. The bustling streets contrasted sharply with Charlotte's quiet integration into a prestigious restaurant kitchen, where she faced daily challenges. The kitchen environment was filled with noise and urgency. Working the grill, Charlotte endured physical strain, yet she remained resilient without complaints. The demanding nature of New York required her to continuously demonstrate her capabilities. Though the work hours were lengthy and compensation minimal, it allowed her to continue her search for her siblings in her spare time. When not engaged in kitchen duties, Charlotte tirelessly researched potential leads regarding Sophie and Jack, but the vast city complicated her search. As weeks passed, her endeavors yielded few results, leaving her exhausted and disappointed each night. Nevertheless, her determination to find her siblings persisted. Thoughts of her siblings' well-being were a constant presence in her mind. Charlotte envisioned Sophie as an adult, potentially living nearby, while she reminisced about Jack as the young boy he once was. Despite the millions of narratives within the city, hers remained centered on the absence of her family members. Simultaneously, Sophie thrived in her office, surrounded by symbols of her accomplishments. She had successfully established her life in New York. A good life. Her career in business had taken off, and on paper everything seemed perfect, but as the years passed, the sense of something missing grew stronger. Her days were filled with meetings and deadlines, and though she was good at what she did, there was a hollowness that followed her. It was an ache that no amount of professional achievements could fill. Sophie still remembered Charlotte's face, sharp, protective, always watching over her. The memory of her sister had faded over time, but it had never disappeared. It lingered, especially in the quiet moments late at night, when the city noise died down and there was nothing left to distract her. Sophie had been too young to fully understand what happened back then, but now as an adult, she felt the weight of those missing years more deeply. One evening as Sophie sat by her, staring out at the skyline, she felt the tug of that old familiar question. Where is she? She had spent years suppressing it, pushing it aside in favor of her career, her life. But now, as the city lights flickered below, the need to know became overwhelming. The decision to search for Charlotte didn't come all at once. It was slow building, like the steady hum of traffic outside her window. Over the next few days, Sophie found herself thinking more and more about her sister, where she might be, what she might be doing. Eventually she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know. Sophie started with records, old files from the foster care system, names she barely remembered from her childhood. The process was frustrating. So many records had been lost, misplaced, or buried under bureaucratic layers. But she, making phone calls, tracking down whatever scraps of information she could find. The autumn air in Indianapolis had a bite to it, sharp and unforgiving. Jack walked across campus, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his head down as the wind tugged at his collar. Classes were a blur for Jack, whose mind wandered to a forgotten past. At 20, he seemed to have a good life with a scholarship, friends, and a loving family. His adoptive parents provided him with support and belonging, yet he felt a quiet void inside. His early childhood memories were hazy, with only brief flashes of faces and a comforting presence. He remembered his sister and Charlotte, who felt like a second mother, but the memories slipped away upon waking. This longing to know more about his sisters, whom he was separated from, troubled him. His adoptive parents had shared that he had 2 sisters, but details were scarce. Recently, his urge to uncover his past intensified, becoming harder to ignore. Despite trying to convince himself of his current life's adequacy, the mystery of his past lingered unresolved. One evening, Jack sat at his desk, drawn to an old shoebox his adoptive mother had given him. It held remnants of his life before adoption, and tonight he felt compelled to explore it. As he opened the box, the scent of old paper filled the air, and he discovered a worn photograph of a young girl with dark hair and a warm yet serious expression. Charlotte. Jack's heart clenched as he studied the photo, trying to reconcile the girl in the picture with the fragmented memories in his mind. This was her, the sister who had taken care of him, the one who had been there when their mother wasn't. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her face so clearly. The back of the photograph was blank, no clue as to where or when it had been taken. But it was a start. Jack held the picture in his hands, his mind racing with questions. Where was she now? Was she still looking for him and Sophie? What had happened to her? He knew then that he couldn't wait any longer. He had to find them. The need to understand his past, to connect with the sisters he barely remembered, was too strong to ignore. He had always felt the emptiness, but now he knew what was missing. Clutching the photograph, Jack decided to search for his past, knowing he couldn't ignore his origins any longer. He planned to follow every lead and record to find Charlotte and Sophie. He needed this journey to feel complete again. Late one night in his dorm, Jack, distracted by studies, absently browsed articles and social media. He hadn't meant to think about his past, but his search for Charlotte resurfaced buried thoughts. He spent hours online looking for leads but found nothing substantial until that night. A blog post about a sister lost in foster care piqued his interest. The author, Sophie, shared memories eerily similar to his own, including being separated from a sister and a shared family. Recipe. It felt like a reflection of his life. Jack's heart raced as he reached the end of the post, where Sophie expressed her longing to connect. He quickly replied, introducing himself as her brother, Jack, who was also searching for their sister. The following hours flew by as they exchanged messages, confirming their connection. They shared stories that revealed their shared upbringing and routines. Jack sent Sophie a cherished photo of Charlotte, and her swift reply confirmed their bond. That's her. That's our sister. For the first time, Jack felt the pieces of his past falling into place. He had found Sophie, the sister he barely remembered, but had always wondered about. The emotional weight of it was overwhelming. Sophie was equally shaken, her messages becoming more frantic, more determined. We have to find her, Sophie wrote, as if the thought had just occurred to her. Jack nodded to himself, typing back quickly, we do. I won't stop until we do. They decided to meet in person to plan the next steps of their search. With Sophie's persistence and Jack's resolve, they knew they couldn't stop now. Charlotte was out there, and they were closer than ever to bringing their family back together. The kitchen was Charlotte's sanctuary, a place where time slowed and the world outside became distant in New York. She had found her rhythm among the clan of pots, the hiss of steam, and the steady rhythm of chopping knives. She had climbed her way from pre-cook to sous chef in a kitchen known for its exacting standards. Every dish was precise, every plate a reflection of her discipline and dedication. But no matter how many hours she poured into her work, no matter how many accolades she received, there was always something missing. Charlotte wiped her brow with the back of her hand as she finished plating the last dish for the evening service. The restaurant's dim lights reflected in the perfectly composed plates, but she couldn't quite shake the nagging sense that something was off. The praise, the success, it all felt hollow. At times, there was an emptiness she carried with her, a void that no amount of culinary success could fill when she was in the kitchen. Moving with the fluid grace of someone who had mastered her craft, she could almost forget, But late at night, memories of Sophie and Jack returned to her. She wondered about their safety and if they remembered her. Her career was thriving, with many opportunities arising. Among them, one stood out, a national cooking competition. It was a significant moment for most chefs and even more for Charlotte. She was surrounded by cameras and producers, but her focus was personal. This was her chance to reconnect with her lost family. The challenge was to prepare a dish reflecting her journey. Charlotte's hands worked skillfully, yet her mind was distracted. She felt the pressure of the cameras and judges, but she ignored it. Her cooking was for Sophie and Jack, not for the competition. As she plated her mother's vegetable soup, memories of love and warmth flooded back. Making this dish was her way to express her story of love, loss, and survival. When called forward, Charlotte felt nervous but determined. As the judges tasted her dish, the host asked what inspired it, and Charlotte took a moment before speaking. "This dish it's about my family. I grew up in foster care, separated from my younger siblings when I was barely a teenager. This soup was something my mother used to make for us, and when she passed I took over cooking for my brother and sister. It was the last meal we had together before we were taken away from each other." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed through. "I don't know where they are now. I haven't seen them in years, but if they're watching, I want them to know I'm still here. I've made a life for myself, but I've never stopped thinking about them." The room was momentarily silent, heavy with her words. Charlotte felt vulnerable but had expressed herself. For the first time in years, she sensed peace. As she stepped back, cameras focused on her. Sophie and Jack might be watching, and that comforted her. Jack hadn't intended to watch TV, but couldn't study. His mind was occupied with thoughts of Charlotte's photograph, so he turned on the TV for distraction. He mindlessly flipped through channels until a cooking competition caught his attention. He almost changed the channel but froze at the sight of a familiar woman. Jack leaned forward, heart racing. "Charlotte," he whispered. Sophie nearby heard him. "What did you say?" she asked, but Jack remained transfixed. The chef spoke softly, sharing her story, and Jack felt overwhelmed. "I grew up in foster care," Charlotte revealed, her voice trembling. "We were split up after our mother died. I hope they're watching." Sophie stood behind Jack, eyes wide in shock. "Jack," she said, emotion thick in her voice. "It's Charlotte." Jack nodded, memories rushing back, recognizing his sister. "We have to go," Sophie insisted urgently. The decision was made without discussion. Minutes later, they sped toward the studio, their drive a blur. Jack glanced at Sophie, who held their photograph tightly. "What if we're too late?" he worried. "We won't be," Sophie reassured him. "We're going to see her." The studio was of security and bright lights, but neither Jack nor Sophie noticed their hearts were pounding, adrenaline coursing through their veins. As they pushed their way toward the stage, they had to see her, they had to inside. The show was still going on. Charlotte was standing at the front waiting for the judges to deliver their verdict, but she looked distracted. Her eyes scanned the audience as if she were searching for something, someone. Jack and Sophie stopped at the back of the room, their breath catching in their throats. There she was, the woman they had thought about every day. The woman, who had been lost to them for so many years, was standing right in front of them. "Charlotte!" Jack shouted, his voice breaking through the noise of the crowd. Charlotte's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto. For a moment time seemed to stand still. The noise of the audience faded into the background and all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. She blinked as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing. Sophie stepped forward, holding up the photograph, her hand shaking. "It's us," she called, her voice cracking with emotion. "We found you." The photo was all it took. Charlotte's face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth. As tears spilled down her cheeks, she stepped off the stage, her legs weak beneath her, and ran toward them. Jack and Sophie were already moving, pushing through the rows of seats, their eyes locked on their sister. When they reached each other, the three of them collapsed into an embrace, their arms tangled together, holding on as if they might lose each other again if they let go. Charlotte sobbed into Jack's shoulder, tears soaking into his shirt. Sophie clung to them both, her breath hitching with the force of her emotions. "I thought I'd lost you. Charlotte whispered, her voice choked with tears. I thought I'd never see you again. Jack tightened his hold on her, his own eyes wet. We've been looking for you, Charlotte. We've missed you so much. Sophie couldn't speak, the lump in her throat too large. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face as she buried her head in Charlotte's shoulder. They stood like that for what felt like forever, the world around them disappearing, the years of separation melting away in the warmth of their reunion. Finally, Charlotte pulled back, wiping her eyes. Though the tears kept coming, she looked at them both, taking in every detail: the way Jack had grown taller, the way Sophie's eyes